Alex Reeves had always believed that the hardest part of retirement would be adjusting to a slower pace of life, but standing in the observation deck of Kepler Station watching cargo ships navigate the asteroid field beyond, he realized the real challenge would be leaving behind a universe that still felt full of unfinished stories. After 25 years of deep space exploration, the idea of settling on a quiet agricultural world should have been appealing, yet something about the approaching transition left him feeling incomplete. "Captain Reeves," a voice spoke behind him, carrying an accent that suggested one of the station's many alien residents. "I believe you requested assistance with colonial property assessments." Alex turned to find himself facing a young woman whose appearance immediately marked her as Etherean, tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to carry its own subtle luminescence and eyes that held depth suggesting far more awareness than most beings possessed. Her hair moved with currents that had nothing to do with air circulation, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made standard sound almost musical. "That's right," Alex replied, noting how she seemed to shimmer slightly in the station's artificial lighting. "I'm looking at retirement properties on Thesha Prime. Heard you're the best cultural liaison for understanding agricultural colony protocols." "I'm Lyran Valdris," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that seemed more human than Etherean. "I've been helping off-worlders navigate colonial transitions for 8 years. Thesha Prime is an excellent choice for someone seeking peaceful retirement." As they shook hands, Alex noticed that her touch carried a slight electrical sensation and that her luminescence seemed to dim momentarily, as if his presence was somehow draining rather than energizing her. "Are you feeling all right? You seem tired." Lyran's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into professional courtesy. "Station life can be exhausting for Etherians. We're not well suited to artificial environments for extended periods." "How long have you been on Kepler Station?" 6 years continuously, Lyran replied, leading him toward a consultation area decorated with holographic displays of various colonial worlds. "My family has maintained the cultural liaison position here for 3 generations. It's considered an honor to represent Etherian interests in galactic commerce." Alex studied her carefully, noting how her movements seemed slightly constrained, as if she were conserving energy for essential functions. 6 years without returning home? That seems difficult for someone whose people are supposed to have strong connections to natural environments. "Duty often requires personal sacrifice," Lyran said, though Alex caught a note in her voice that suggested the sacrifice might be more significant than she was letting on. "Now, regarding Thesha Prime, the agricultural zones offer excellent soil composition and the climate cycle should suit human circadian rhythms well." For the next hour, Lyran provided detailed information about colonial life with the kind of expertise that suggested extensive research rather than personal experience. She knew soil compositions, weather patterns, legal requirements, and cultural considerations for dozens of worlds, but when Alex asked about her own preferences or experiences, her answers became vague and distant. "You've never actually visited any of these places, have you?" Alex asked during a pause in their discussion. Lyran's luminescence dimmed further, and Alex realized he'd touched on something sensitive. "My role requires me to remain available for consultation. Travel to colonial worlds would compromise my ability to serve visiting species effectively." "That sounds like a diplomatic way of saying you're not allowed to leave." "I'm not a prisoner, Captain Reeves," Lyran replied, but her tone suggested the distinction might be more technical than practical. "I have responsibilities that I take seriously." Alex leaned back in his chair, studying this remarkable being who seemed to be slowly fading like a plant kept too long from sunlight. "Lyran, when was the last time you were on a world with natural atmosphere? Real soil, unfiltered starlight, weather that wasn't computer-controlled?" The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her luminescence flickered erratically, and Alex saw her hands tremble before she clasped them together to hide the reaction. "Captain, such questions aren't relevant to your colonial consultation." "Maybe not, but they're relevant to understanding why someone who knows everything about beautiful worlds seems so sad when describing them," Alex said gently. "You talk about Thesha Prime's meadows like someone describing water while dying of thirst." Lyran was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on holographic displays that showed rolling hills and pristine forests. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of longing so profound it made Alex's chest ache in sympathy. "Etherians aren't meant for artificial environments," she said quietly. "Our nervous systems are designed to interact with natural electromagnetic fields, living ecosystems, authentic atmospheric compositions. Prolonged exposure to synthetic conditions causes a kind of spiritual deterioration. And you've been experiencing that deterioration for 6 years?" "The work is important," Lyran replied, but Alex could see the cost written in her dimming luminescence and the careful way she moved, as if every motion required conscious effort. "My people need representation in galactic affairs. Someone has to maintain the cultural bridges that allow peaceful interaction between species." Alex found himself studying this extraordinary being who was slowly sacrificing her health and well-being for abstract diplomatic necessities. "Lyran, what would happen if you just left? Took a vacation, visited one of these worlds you know so much about?" Her laugh was bitter music. "The Etherian Cultural Council considers my position essential to maintaining our species' place in galactic society. Previous attempts to request leave have been unsuccessful." "Previous attempts?" "2 years ago, I petitioned for medical leave to visit our homeworld. The request was denied on the grounds that my health concerns were secondary to cultural obligations." Lyran's patterns flickered with what might have been anger. "Last year, I requested temporary assignment to an agricultural research station. That was also denied." Alex felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand the full scope of her situation. "So you're essentially trapped here until what? Until you die from environmental incompatibility?" "Until the Cultural Council determines that my successor is adequately trained to replace me," Lyran corrected. "Though at current rates of recruitment and education, that process could take decades." Alex stared at her, processing the implications of what she'd just revealed. This remarkable being, whose knowledge and expertise were helping him plan a peaceful retirement surrounded by natural beauty, was herself a prisoner condemned to slow death in an artificial environment, her own dreams sacrificed for bureaucratic convenience. "Lyran," he said carefully, "when I retire to Thesha Prime, there will be openings for cultural consultants to help the colony navigate relationships with various alien species. The pay is decent, and the work would involve extensive travel to natural environments for research and consultation." Her luminescence brightened dramatically before dimming again as reality reasserted itself. "Captain, that's a kind offer, but impossible. My obligations. What if those obligations could be transferred or fulfilled differently?" Alex interrupted. "What if there were alternatives that served your people's interests while allowing you to survive?" Lyran looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and despair in equal measures. "Captain Reeves, you don't understand the complexities involved. The legal frameworks, the cultural expectations, the diplomatic agreements that depend on continuity of representation." "Then help me understand," Alex said. "Because watching you fade away while knowing everything about worlds you'll never see feels wrong in ways I can't ignore." For the first time since they'd met, Lyran smiled with something that looked like genuine emotion rather than professional courtesy. "Captain, are you offering to help someone you've known for 2 hours solve problems that have defeated every legal expert I've consulted over 6 years?" "I'm offering to try," Alex replied simply. "Because sometimes the right thing to do is obvious even when the method isn't clear." As they sat together in the consultation area surrounded by images of worlds that represented freedom for him and impossible dreams for her, Alex realized that his retirement plans had just become significantly more complicated. But looking at Lyran's face as she dared to hope for alternatives she'd been told were impossible, he found himself thinking that perhaps some complications were worth embracing. The next morning brought Alex face to face with the Byzantine complexity of interspecies law and cultural obligations that kept Lyran bound to Kepler Station. Dr. Kethra Vindris, the Etherian Cultural Council's representative, received him in an office that managed to feel both opulent and sterile, decorated with artificial representations of natural beauty that somehow made the absence of actual life more pronounced. Captain Reeves, Dr. Vindris spoke with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to deflecting difficult questions. I understand you've taken an interest in our cultural liaison situation. While we appreciate your concern, Lyran's role is fundamental to maintaining Etherian diplomatic relationships. At the cost of her health and well-being? Alex asked directly. I've seen the medical literature on Etherian environmental needs. 6 years of artificial atmosphere exposure is approaching toxic levels. MS. Valdris knew the requirements of her position when she accepted it, Dr. Vindris replied smoothly. Cultural service often requires personal sacrifice for the greater good of one's people. Alex studied the representative, noting how her own luminescence seemed artificially enhanced, as if she were using technological supplements to maintain the appearance of health. When did she accept it? Was this a voluntary career choice or a family obligation she inherited? The distinction is irrelevant. She serves with honor and competence, fulfilling obligations that benefit both Etherian society and galactic diplomatic stability. That doesn't answer my question about consent, Alex pressed. Did Lyran choose this position, or was she assigned to it? Dr. Vindris's expression grew cold. Captain, I'm not sure what involvement you imagine yourself having in internal Etherian cultural matters, but our customs and obligations are not subject to outside interference. Alex leaned forward, his exploration career having taught him to recognize bureaucratic evasion when he encountered it. Dr. Vindris, what would it take for Lyran to be released from her obligations? Hypothetically, cultural service obligations can only be dissolved through formal succession by a qualified family member, completion of a predetermined service term, or documented medical incapacity that prevents function. Dr. Vindris paused, consulting her files. Ms. Valdris has no eligible family members, her service term is indefinite pending succession planning, and her medical reports indicate manageable stress rather than incapacitating illness. Manageable stress? Alex felt anger building in his chest. She's experiencing environmental toxicity that's slowly killing her nervous system. Station medical facilities provide adequate support for managing Etherian health concerns, Dr. Vindris replied dismissively. MS. Valdris receives regular treatments that maintain her functional capacity. Alex realized he was dealing with someone who viewed Lyran as a valuable resource to be maintained rather than a person whose life mattered independently. What about temporary leave? Short-term assignments that would allow environmental recovery? Previous requests have been evaluated and denied due to operational necessity, Dr. Vindris said. The consistency of representation is crucial for maintaining diplomatic relationships that benefit both Etherian interests and galactic stability. And if someone were to offer alternative arrangements? Solutions that maintain diplomatic continuity while allowing environmental relief? Dr. Vindris regarded him with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for potential threats. Captain Reeves, are you suggesting interference in established cultural obligations? I'm suggesting that there might be creative solutions that serve everyone's interests, Alex replied carefully. Including Etherian interests in maintaining healthy, effective representation. The current arrangement serves Etherian interests adequately, Dr. Vindris stated with finality. Ms. Valdris's personal preferences are secondary to cultural obligations that extend beyond individual concerns. After leaving the meeting, Alex found Lyran in the station's hydroponics bay, where she spent her off-duty hours tending to the few living plants that existed in Kepler Station's artificial environment. Watching her work among the carefully controlled growing systems, he could see how even this minimal contact with living organisms seemed to restore some of her natural luminescence. Any luck with the Cultural Council? She asked without looking up from a flowering vine that seemed to respond to her touch with increased vigor. Dar. Vindris made it clear that your obligations are considered permanent and non-negotiable, Alex replied, settling beside her among the growing plants. She talked about you like you were equipment rather than a person. That's not entirely inaccurate from the Etherian perspective, Lyran said sadly. Cultural service positions are viewed as sacred trusts that supersede individual desires. The person becomes secondary to the function they serve. Alex watched her hands move through the plant's foliage, noting how the simple contact seemed to energize both her and the vegetation. Lyran, what would happen if you just disappeared? Left the station without permission. I would be classified as a cultural deserter, she replied immediately. Any Etherian settlement would be required to detain and return me. I'd be cut off from my people completely, unable to access cultural support or community connections. But you'd be alive and healthy instead of slowly dying in an artificial environment. Lyran paused in her work, her luminescence flickering with complex emotions. Alex, you're talking about asking me to choose between slow death with my people and immediate exile from everything I've ever known. Neither option feels like living. Alex considered this, understanding for the first time the full scope of the trap that held her. What if there were a third option? Something that provided cultural continuity while allowing you environmental relief? Such as? I don't know yet, Alex admitted. But I've spent 25 years solving problems that seemed impossible at first assessment. Usually, the key is finding an approach that nobody's considered because they've been thinking about the situation too narrowly. Lyran looked at him with an expression that mixed hope with resignation. Alex, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but every legal expert I've consulted has reached the same conclusion. The cultural obligations are ironclad, and there are no loopholes that would allow release without devastating personal consequences. Maybe the legal experts have been approaching this as a legal problem instead of a human problem, Alex suggested. Sometimes the solutions that matter most can't be found in law books. As they worked together among the hydroponic plants, Alex found himself thinking about the various impossible situations he'd encountered during his exploration career, planets that shouldn't have supported life but did, species that shouldn't have been able to communicate but found ways to connect, solutions that emerged not from following established protocols but from recognizing that rules sometimes needed to be rewritten when they failed to serve the people they were supposed to protect. Lyran, he said finally, what if I told you I was thinking about changing my retirement plans? What do you mean? What if instead of settling on a quiet agricultural world by myself, I was considering establishing a cultural consulting business that would require extensive travel to natural environments? Alex paused, noting how her luminescence brightened with interest. A business that might need a partner with expertise in interspecies relations and agricultural colony development. Alex, that's a beautiful dream, but the practical obstacles. The practical obstacles, Alex interrupted gently, might be smaller than the moral ones involved in watching someone extraordinary waste away because bureaucrats can't imagine alternatives to systems that are killing her. As they sat together in the hydroponic bay's artificial ecosystem, surrounded by life that existed only because someone had created conditions for it to flourish, Alex realized that his retirement plans had shifted from escape to rescue, not just of Lyran, but of the possibilities that their partnership might create together. The question was no longer whether he would help her find freedom, but how they would build a life that honored both their needs while navigating the systems that sought to keep them apart. Alex's investigation into alternative solutions led him deeper into the labyrinthine world of interspecies law, where he discovered that Lyran's situation was far from unique. The galaxy was full of beings trapped by cultural obligations, legal frameworks, and bureaucratic systems that prioritized institutional continuity over individual well-being. The problem, explained Jorik Thane, a retired legal advocate who specialized in interspecies rights cases, is that most galactic law treats cultural obligations as sacred and inviolable. Challenging them directly usually fails because the legal system assumes that traditional practices serve legitimate community interests. They sat in Thane's cluttered office, surrounded by case files documenting decades of attempts to free individuals from various forms of cultural bondage. But surely there must be precedents for release based on medical necessity or humanitarian concerns. Scattered successes, mostly involving situations where the cultural group itself recognized that their practices were causing harm, Thane replied. But cases like your friends, where the cultural authorities explicitly reject health concerns in favor of institutional needs, those are much harder to resolve through conventional legal channels. Alex studied the files, noting patterns of systematic abuse disguised as cultural tradition. What about non-conventional approaches? Are there alternatives to direct legal challenge? Thane gave him a look that suggested he was entering dangerous territory. Captain, there are networks that help individuals escape situations like your friends, but those approaches involve significant risks. Identity changes, relocation to non-extradition territories, permanent severing of cultural ties. Networks. Underground organizations that assist beings trapped by systems that prioritize institutional interests over individual welfare, Thane explained carefully. They operate in legal gray areas, helping people disappear when conventional legal remedies fail. Alex felt something shift in his thinking as he began to understand that Lyran's freedom might require stepping outside the legal frameworks that had created her captivity in the first place. These networks, how do they work? I can't provide specific details, but generally they involve creating new identities for individuals who need to escape situations that conventional law cannot address, Thane said. The process requires significant resources, careful planning, and willingness to abandon previous legal existence entirely. And the success rate? High, for those who complete the process, Thane replied. But the personal costs are enormous. Complete separation from previous life, permanent exile from cultural community, constant vigilance against discovery by authorities seeking to reclaim fugitive individuals. Alex thanked Thane for the information and returned to Kepler Station with his mind churning through possibilities that felt both dangerous and necessary. Finding Lyran in her usual spot in the hydroponics bay, he settled beside her among the growing plants before sharing what he'd learned. Alex, she said after he'd explained the underground networks and their potential solutions, you're talking about asking me to become a ghost. No legal identity, no cultural connections, no way to return to any life I've known. I'm talking about asking you to choose life over slow death, Alex replied. Everything else can be rebuilt. Lyran was quiet for a long time, her hands moving absently through the plant foliage as she processed the implications. And you? What would this mean for your retirement plans, your legal status, your connection to human society? It would mean abandoning the quiet retirement I thought I wanted in favor of something more complicated but infinitely more meaningful, Alex said honestly. It would mean building a new life together instead of settling into solitary peace. Alex, you've known me for less than a week. You're talking about completely restructuring your future for someone who's essentially a stranger. Alex considered this, recognizing the truth in her observation while also understanding that some connections transcended conventional timelines. Lyran, I've spent 25 years exploring the galaxy, encountering thousands of beings across dozens of species. I've never met anyone whose well-being felt as important to me as yours does right now. That could be rescue fantasy rather than genuine connection, she pointed out. The desire to save someone from a situation that troubles you personally. It could be, Alex agreed. Or it could be recognition that I've found something I didn't know I was looking for. A partnership that makes both our lives more meaningful than either could achieve alone. Lyran's luminescence flickered with complex emotions as she weighed options that felt equally impossible and necessary. The cultural obligations I'd be abandoning, they're not just bureaucratic inconveniences. They're connections to my heritage, my identity, everything that defines who I am as an Etherian. They're also killing you slowly while preventing you from experiencing the natural environments your people are supposed to have sacred connections with, Alex replied gently. How much heritage can you preserve if you don't survive to carry it forward? As they sat together among the artificial ecosystem's carefully controlled life, Alex realized that their conversation was about more than escape plans or legal alternatives. It was about choosing between different definitions of loyalty, loyalty to systems that demanded sacrifice, or loyalty to each other and the possibility of building something better together. If we did this, Lyran said finally, if we abandoned everything familiar and started over completely, what would that life look like? I don't know, Alex admitted. We'd have to figure it out as we went, finding ways to use our combined skills while staying ahead of anyone who might be looking for us. It would be uncertain, probably dangerous, definitely different from anything either of us has experienced. And potentially wonderful. Potentially wonderful, Alex confirmed. If we could make it work. Lyran turned to face him fully, her luminescence brightening to levels he'd never seen before. Alex, are you certain this is what you want? A life built around protecting someone who might always be looking over her shoulder? I'm certain that watching you fade away in service to systems that don't value your well-being is something I can't do, Alex replied. Whether that qualifies as wanting or needing or something else entirely, I'm not sure. But I know that leaving you here feels wrong in ways that would make any retirement hollow. As station lights cycled to simulate evening, creating the illusion of natural day-night rhythms in their artificial environment, Alex and Lyran began discussing practical details of escape plans that felt both terrifying and liberating. They were talking about abandoning everything familiar in favor of possibilities they could barely imagine, but somehow the conversation felt less like planning disaster and more like designing hope. The question was no longer whether they would attempt this radical solution, but whether they could execute it successfully while preserving their lives and a connection that had made such dramatic change feel not just possible, but necessary. The escape plan took shape over several days of careful preparation, with Alex using his remaining shore leave to gather resources and establish contact with the underground networks that Thane had mentioned. The process required him to navigate shadowy corners of Kepler Station that he'd never known existed, meeting with beings who specialized in helping others disappear when conventional systems failed them. Identity reconstruction for 2 individuals, one human, one Etherian, explained Vera Solis, a former intelligence operative who now ran one of the more reliable disappearance services. Complete documentation packages, biometric modifications for the Etherian to prevent species-specific tracking, transportation to a non-extradition territory. Total cost, 200,000 credits. Alex reviewed the estimate, calculating against his retirement savings and realizing that helping Lyran would consume most of his accumulated wealth. What about ongoing security? Protection against discovery. First year of monitoring and emergency relocation insurance included, Vera replied. After that, you're on your own unless you purchase extended coverage. Most clients establish stable new lives within 12 months if they follow protocols carefully. And success rate? 93% for clients who complete the full program, Vera said. The 7% failure rate usually involves individuals who maintain contact with previous associations or return to monitored territories prematurely. Alex signed the preliminary agreements and transferred the initial payment, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror as he committed to a course of action that would transform both their lives irrevocably. The next phase involved convincing Lyran that the risks were manageable and the potential rewards worth the enormous sacrifices required. He found her in the station's small observation lounge, staring out at the stars with an expression that suggested she was already practicing saying goodbye to the only life she'd known. When he settled beside her, she turned with a smile that carried more peace than he'd seen from her since they'd met. I've been thinking about our conversation, she said quietly. About choosing between slow death and uncertain freedom. And I realized that I've been dying slowly for 6 years, telling myself it was noble sacrifice while watching my life drain away in service to systems that don't actually care whether I survive, Lyran said. Whatever risks we face together can't be worse than the certainty of continuing deterioration. Alex felt relief flood through him as he recognized that she'd reached the same conclusion independently. Lyran, there's something I need to tell you about the escape process. It's not just about leaving. It's about completely reconstructing our identities, permanently severing connections to our previous lives. I understand. No contact with Etherian communities, no return to familiar territories, no way to maintain cultural connections that define my heritage. Are you prepared for that level of separation? Lyran was quiet for a moment, her luminescence cycling through patterns that suggested complex emotional processing. Alex, my heritage as an Etherian includes deep connection to natural environments, harmony with living ecosystems, and spiritual communion with authentic atmospheric conditions. The cultural obligations keeping me here prevent me from experiencing any of those things. So leaving might actually allow you to reconnect with authentic Etherian heritage. It might allow me to discover what Etherian heritage actually means when it's chosen freely rather than imposed through institutional control, Lyran clarified. I can't preserve culture by dying in service to systems that prevent me from living it. Over the next few hours, Alex shared the details of Vera's plan, explaining the identity reconstruction process, the transportation arrangements, and the settlement options available in territories beyond Etherian jurisdiction. Lyran listened with the focused attention of someone making the most important decision of her life. "There's one more thing," Alex said finally. "The new identities will establish us as partners, business colleagues with a consulting firm specializing in agricultural colony development. It provides cover for our relationship while creating legitimate reasons for travel to natural environments. Partners in business and in life." "If that's what you want," Alex replied carefully. "The documentation allows for either interpretation, but the emotional reality is something we'd have to figure out as we go." Lyran reached for his hand, her touch carrying the familiar electrical sensation that had become one of his favorite aspects of their growing connection. "Alex, what we've found together over the past week, the understanding, the caring, the way you've been willing to risk everything to help someone you barely know, that feels more real than any relationship I've had in years of cultural service. Even though we're talking about building it under assumed identities in territories neither of us has ever seen. Especially because we're willing to build something authentic despite artificial constraints," Lyran replied. "Most relationships develop within established social frameworks. Ours would be created entirely from our choices about who we want to become together." As they finalized their decision to proceed with the escape plan, Alex realized that he was no longer thinking about retiring from exploration. He was embarking on the most important journey of his life, with a partner whose presence transformed the entire meaning of adventure. They were choosing uncertainty over safety, possibility over resignation, connection over isolation. "Lyran," he said as they prepared to return to their quarters for their final night on Kepler Station, "tomorrow we become different people leading a life we're creating together. Are you ready for that?" Her smile brightened her luminescence to levels that made the observation lounge feel filled with living starlight. "Alex, I've been ready for 6 years. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until I met you." As they walked through Kepler Station's corridors for the last time as their original selves, Alex reflected on how quickly his carefully planned retirement had transformed into something far more complex and infinitely more meaningful. He was about to abandon everything familiar in favor of possibilities he could barely imagine, but somehow the prospect felt less like loss and more like finally beginning to live. The transformation began at dawn, station time, in a medical facility that existed in Kepler Station's deepest maintenance levels, where Vera's team conducted the biometric modifications that would make conventional tracking impossible. Lyran underwent procedures that altered her luminescence patterns and neural signatures while Alex received implants that would confuse human identification systems, both emerging with documentation that established them as Dr. Elena Vasquez and James Morrison, agricultural consultants from the outer colonies. "The key to successful identity transition," Vera explained as they reviewed their new documentation, "is psychological commitment to becoming these people rather than pretending to be them. Elena and James aren't disguises, they're who you are now, with histories and backgrounds that support your cover story." Alex, now James, studied the documentation that established his new identity as a specialist in sustainable farming techniques for frontier colonies. These background files are incredibly detailed. University records, work history, even personal references. Complete fabrication that will withstand most investigative scrutiny, Vera confirmed. Elena's background as a cultural integration specialist provides logical reasons for her knowledge of interspecies relations, while explaining any unusual behaviors as adaptations from growing up in mixed-species colonies. Lyran, now Elena, tested her modified luminescence patterns, watching how the alterations changed her natural glow in ways that would confuse Etherian identification protocols. "It feels strange, like wearing someone else's skin. But also, liberating. I haven't had a choice about identity since childhood." "The psychological adjustment typically takes several weeks," Vera said. "During that time, practice thinking of yourselves by your new names, respond to your cover stories as if they were actual memories, and avoid any behaviors that might suggest concealed identities. Their transportation to the frontier colony of New Thesha involved a circuitous route through 3 different star systems, using cargo haulers and passenger vessels that operated beyond the major shipping networks where travel records might be monitored. The journey took 10 days, providing time for both of them to adjust to their new identities while processing the magnitude of the changes they'd initiated. "Elena," James said during one of their quiet conversations in the cramped quarters of a freight transport, testing how the new names felt in actual conversation. "Do you regret leaving your old life behind?" "I regret that leaving was necessary," Elena replied, her modified luminescence creating different patterns than he'd grown accustomed to. "But I don't regret choosing life over slow death, or choosing to build something meaningful with someone who cares about my well-being. Even though we're essentially fugitives now. Even though we're finally free to choose our own path," Elena corrected. "James, for 6 years I've lived according to other people's definitions of my obligations and value. Now we get to discover what we actually want our lives to become." New Thesha proved to be everything Alex had hoped for in a retirement destination: rolling hills covered with native vegetation, clear streams that supported complex ecosystems, and atmospheric conditions that made Elena's luminescence brighten dramatically within hours of arrival. The colony consisted of roughly 3,000 settlers from a dozen different species, all working together to build sustainable communities that honored the planet's natural environment. Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Morrison, colony administrator Sarah Chin greeted them at the small spaceport. "Welcome to New Thesha. We've been looking forward to your consultation services ever since we received your applications." Their cover story proved remarkably effective. Elena's expertise in interspecies cultural navigation and James's background in sustainable agriculture provided genuine value to a colony struggling with the complexities of multi-species cooperation in agricultural development. Within weeks, they'd established both professional credibility and personal relationships that made their integration feel natural rather than forced. "The beautiful thing about frontier colonies," Elena observed as they worked together to help resolve a dispute between human farmers and Valhari herders over land usage rights, "is that everyone here chose to leave something behind in favor of building something better. We're not unusual in having complicated histories." "You're thriving here," James noted, watching how Elena's natural luminescence had returned to full brightness in the planet's authentic environment. "Your nervous system is recovering from the artificial atmosphere exposure faster than I expected. Etherian physiology is remarkably adaptive when given proper environmental conditions," Elena replied. "But more than that, I'm thriving because I'm finally able to live according to my own choices rather than obligations imposed by others." Their relationship evolved naturally as they worked side by side, establishing not just a business partnership but also a genuine romantic connection that felt uncomplicated by the power dynamics and artificial constraints that had characterized Elena's previous existence. They discovered compatibility in both professional collaboration and personal intimacy, building a life together that honored both their individual needs and their shared values. 6 months after their arrival on New Thesha, as they sat together on the porch of the small house they'd built overlooking the colony's central valley, Elena reflected on the transformation that had brought them to this point. "James," she said, using his chosen name with the ease of long practice, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd simply proceeded with your original retirement plans?" "I'd be living alone on some quiet world, probably spending my time gardening and reading historical accounts of other people's adventures," James replied. "It would have been peaceful, but it wouldn't have been meaningful. And now? Now I wake up every morning next to someone extraordinary, working on projects that matter to communities we actually care about, building a life that feels both challenging and fulfilling," James said. "Elena, what we have together is better than anything I could have achieved alone." Elena's luminescence brightened with contentment as she considered their journey from that first meeting in Kepler Station's consultation area to this moment of peaceful satisfaction on a world that felt like home. "You know what I realized recently?" "What's that?" "When I whispered that you'd have to take me too, I wasn't asking you to rescue me," Elena said softly. "I was asking you to choose a future where we could discover together what our lives might become if we had the freedom to build them according to our own values." James took her hand, marveling at how this simple gesture, impossible under her previous circumstances due to cultural constraints and environmental toxicity, had become one of the most natural expressions of the connection they'd chosen to nurture. "Elena," he said quietly, "asking me to take you with me was the best thing that ever happened to both of us." As they watched New Thesha's primary star set behind mountains that rose like natural cathedrals into the planet's authentic atmosphere, James and Elena reflected on how quickly their individual stories had become a shared narrative of choosing love over fear, possibility over resignation, and authentic connection over the artificial constraints that had once seemed insurmountable. They had become new people together, not through deception but through the deliberate choice to create identities based on their values rather than their obligations. And in that transformation, they had discovered that sometimes the most profound freedom comes from choosing to bind your future to someone whose dreams align perfectly with your own.